They told him he wasn't good enough. They told him his dreams were unrealistic. They told him he failed. And for a long time, he believed them. At just 23 years old, his football career was over. His dreams were shattered. His confidence was gone. He had $7 left in his pocket. No job, no future, no backup plan. But what if failure wasn't the end? What if pain was preparation? What if rock bottom was actually the foundation? This is not just the story of muscles and fame. This is the story of a man who lost everything and built himself back from nothing. This is the true story of Dwayne Johnson. Before the movies, before the championships, before the millions, there was a boy. A confused kid moving from place to place, watching his parents struggle, watching dreams fall apart. A boy born into wrestling royalty, but surrounded by financial chaos. A boy who would face rejection, depression, and the darkest moments of self-doubt. This documentary is not about success. It's about survival. It's about falling so hard that standing up felt impossible. And yet, he stood up anyway. Dwayne Douglas Johnson entered the world on May 2, 1972, in Hayward, California, into a family that presented a complex dichotomy of public legacy and private turmoil. To the outside observer, his lineage promised privilege and opportunity. His father, Rocky Soulman Johnson, was a pioneering black Nova Scotian professional wrestler, breaking barriers in a predominantly white industry, while his maternal grandfather, High Chief Peter Maivia, was a revered Samoan wrestling legend whose intimidating presence and traditional tattoos made him an icon. This formidable wrestling dynasty suggested a predetermined path to greatness, a life cushioned by fame and financial security. Yet behind this glittering facade lay a reality of profound instability that would shape Dwayne's character in ways both painful and transformative. The family's existence was characterized by constant, disorienting movement, a nomadic journey across state lines and socioeconomic circumstances. Before reaching adolescence, Dwayne had attended 13 different schools, a relentless cycle of new classrooms, unfamiliar faces, and fleeting friendships that prevented the formation of any lasting sense of community or belonging. Each move represented not adventure, but upheaval, stripping away the security that children instinctively crave. Financial precarity haunted the household with spectral persistence. Rocky Johnson's wrestling career, while respected, followed the boom and bust cycles endemic to regional circuits before the national expansion of wrestling entertainment. Eviction notices became familiar documents, utilities were regularly disconnected, and the family occasionally subsisted on government cheese and powdered milk. Young Dwayne became an unwilling witness to the corrosive stress of financial insecurity, observing his parents' arguments over bills with a child's helpless comprehension. He would later recall lying awake at night, listening to the tense discussions about mortgage payments and feeling the weight of uncertainty that no child should bear. This environment of transience and scarcity planted early seeds of anger and alienation. The disconnect between the public perception of his family's wrestling fame and their private struggles created cognitive dissonance in a developing mind. While his classmates saw the son of a famous athlete, Dwayne lived the reality of hand-me-down clothes and disconnected telephones. The anger that simmered within him was not merely adolescent rebellion, but a response to broken promises, the promise of stability, the promise of continuity, the fundamental promise that parents can provide security. This formative period, while marked by deprivation, inadvertently forged resilience and adaptability, qualities that would later become cornerstones of his success. The boy who constantly adapted to new environments was developing the psychological flexibility that would enable him to reinvent himself professionally multiple times in adulthood. The turbulence of Dwayne Johnson's childhood crystallized into full-blown crisis during his teenage years in Honolulu, Hawaii. Transplanted yet again, this time to his mother Atta's birthplace,
He found himself adrift in the liminal space between cultures, not quite Samoan, not quite black, not quite mainstream American. The anger that had germinated during his peripatetic childhood now blossomed into defiance, manifesting in behaviors that systematically dismantled opportunities and tested societal boundaries. School became an afterthought, academic potential squandered in favor of street credibility and immediate gratification. At 15, Johnson began accumulating what he would later term red marks on his permanent record, a series of arrests for theft, fighting, and general delinquency that traced an alarming trajectory toward institutionalization. The petty thefts began as acts of necessity mixed with rebellion, but escalated in frequency and audacity. His physical size, already formidable at 6 feet tall and over 200 pounds by 16, made him both intimidating and targeted, resulting in violent confrontations that sometimes crossed into criminal assault. The police station became a familiar destination, with officers recognizing him on sight and delivering increasingly stern warnings about his future.
The nadir arrived during what should have been a celebratory period. While his father, Rocky, was away wrestling, Dwayne took advantage of his absence to host increasingly wild parties that damaged property and drew law enforcement. During one such incident, neighbors called police after witnessing furniture being thrown from windows. When officers arrived, they found Johnson attempting to flee the scene, resulting in another arrest that threatened to become more than a juvenile offense. His mother, Atta, normally a figure of gentle patience, confronted him with tears of desperation, asking the question that would echo in his memory: "Is this who you want to be?" This period represented what psychologists term a developmental crossroads, where environmental factors and personal choices converged to determine life trajectories. Statistical probabilities suggested Johnson was progressing toward incarceration or worse, another young man of color caught in the school-to-prison pipeline. Yet within this self-destructive spiral, glimmers of awareness began to surface. During a court-mandated counseling session, a perceptive juvenile officer noted that Johnson's thefts weren't for luxury items, but basic necessities, a symptom of the financial insecurity that had haunted his childhood. This observation, while not excusing the behavior, provided crucial context that would later inform Johnson's understanding of his own journey. Simultaneously, his physicality, the very attribute that contributed to his delinquent reputation, began attracting different attention from coaches who saw raw athletic potential beneath the troubled exterior. The football field would become the unlikely crucible where anger could be channeled, discipline learned, and identity rebuilt, but only after he had stared directly at the possible futures awaiting him should he continue his current path. The transformation began not with an epiphany, but with a pragmatic realization. Sports offered both structure and sanctuary. At President William McKinley High School in Honolulu, football coach Steve Van Ness saw beyond Johnson's disciplinary record to recognize extraordinary physical gifts. At 16, he already possessed the size and strength of a collegiate athlete. Van Ness extended what would become a lifeline, an invitation to join the team with the condition that maintaining eligibility required academic improvement and behavioral compliance. For the first time, Johnson encountered a structured environment where his natural aggression could be channeled productively, where consequences were immediate and tangible, and where effort translated directly into results. Football provided something his nomadic childhood had withheld, a sense of belonging. The team became a surrogate family with defined roles and mutual accountability. The weight room became his temple, the field his canvas. Here, the anger that had fueled his delinquency could be transmuted into explosive tackles and relentless drives. Coach Van Ness implemented what Johnson would later call tough love, uncompromising standards coupled with genuine investment in his players' development. Practices were grueling, expectations high, but within this demanding framework, Johnson discovered unfamiliar feelings: pride in accomplishment, respect for discipline, and the first stirrings of purpose. His athletic performance became impossible to ignore.
As a defensive tackle, he dominated opposing offensive lines with a combination of brute strength and surprising agility for his size. College scouts began appearing at games, their interest piqued by this imposing physical specimen with untapped potential. The trajectory of his life began its upward arc. He earned a spot in Hawaii's 1990 Prep Bowl, received all-state honors, and ultimately attracted scholarship offers from multiple Division I programs. The University of Miami, perennial national championship contenders with a reputation for nurturing NFL talent, presented the most compelling opportunity, offering not just athletic development, but escape from the patterns that had previously defined his existence.
Accepting the Miami scholarship represented more than an athletic achievement. It signified validation of his evolving identity. For the young man who had internalized messages of inadequacy through multiple school changes and financial struggles, this recognition from an elite institution served as a powerful counter-narrative. Football became his salvation narrative, the means through which he would achieve financial security, professional success, and personal redemption. The NFL shimmered on the horizon as the ultimate destination, promising to permanently erase the instability of his childhood. With characteristic determination, he committed himself fully to this new path, believing he had finally discovered the equation that would guarantee his future. Athletic talent plus relentless work equaled success. He could not yet imagine how fragile this equation would prove to be. The University of Miami in the early 1990s represented the epicenter of collegiate football excellence, a program steeped in championship tradition, producing NFL talent with assembly line efficiency. Johnson arrived as part of a recruiting class nicknamed the Linebacker Factory, surrounded by extraordinary athletes who had been high school superstars in their own right. The reality adjustment was immediate and humbling. He was no longer the most physically gifted player on the field. Competing against future NFL stars like Warren Sapp and Ray Lewis, Johnson found himself struggling for playing time, often relegated to special teams or backup duties. The bench, unfamiliar territory for someone accustomed to athletic dominance, became his frequent station. This competitive demotion was compounded by the cultural adjustment to Miami itself. The city's vibrant diversity differed significantly from his experiences in Hawaii and earlier locales, presenting new social complexities. More significantly, he carried the weight of expectation, not only his own dreams, but the legacy of athletic excellence associated with his family name. The Johnson on his jersey invited comparisons to his father's accomplishments, adding psychological pressure to his athletic challenges. He later reflected on this period as one of quiet desperation, where he maintained a public facade of confidence while privately grappling with doubts about his place in the program. The decisive blow arrived not from competitive disappointment, but from physical collapse. During spring practice in 1994, while engaging in routine drills, Johnson experienced a sudden excruciating pain in his lower back that radiated down his legs. Medical evaluation revealed a devastating diagnosis: multiple herniated discs with nerve compression, an injury catastrophic for a defensive lineman whose position required explosive lower body power. Specialists delivered the verdict with clinical finality. Continuing to play football risked permanent nerve damage and possible paralysis. His collegiate career was over. The NFL dream extinguished. The psychological impact proved more debilitating than the physical injury. Football had become the cornerstone of his identity, the source of his scholarship, his social standing, his future aspirations. Without it, he faced what psychologists term identity foreclosure, where a central self-concept is abruptly invalidated. Depressed and directionless, he completed his degree in criminology, a choice perhaps subconsciously influenced by his adolescent encounters with law enforcement, but without passion or purpose. A brief, desperate attempt to continue playing with the Calgary Stampeders of the Canadian Football League ended with his release during training camp. Returning to Miami, he assessed his assets: a partially completed degree, a debilitating injury, and $7 in his pocket.
This moment, the convergence of physical limitation, professional termination, and financial desperation, represented the absolute nadir of his young life. The $7 were not metaphorical, but literal, representing both his financial reality and symbolic distance from the wealth and success he had associated with football. He would later describe this period as one of profound emptiness, where he questioned not just his career path, but his fundamental worth. Unbeknownst to him, this complete stripping away of previous identities would create the necessary vacuum for reinvention, but only after he traversed the painful terrain of depression and self-reckoning.
The months following his football termination constituted a psychological wilderness where conventional measures of success lost meaning. Johnson moved into a small, Spartan apartment shared with teammates, surviving on their generosity while concealing the depth of his despair. The structured rhythms that had governed his life, practice schedules, film sessions, weight training, vanished, leaving a void filled with obsessive rumination. He later described this period as characterized by toxic introspection, where he would sit for hours analyzing every decision that had led to this point, each analysis deepening his sense of failure. Clinical depression manifested not as dramatic suffering, but as pervasive numbness, an emotional flatness where even basic hygiene and nutrition felt like insurmountable tasks. He avoided former teammates and coaches, ashamed to admit his circumstances, creating a self-imposed isolation that exacerbated his condition. The physical pain from his back injury served as constant reminder of his lost identity, while the psychological pain stemmed from what he perceived as personal inadequacy. In his internal narrative, he had failed not just as an athlete, but as a man, unable to fulfill the expectations associated with his family's legacy or his own aspirations. A pivotal moment arrived during a phone call with his father, who was touring with WWE, then WWF. Rocky Johnson, recognizing the signs of depression from his own career setbacks, offered neither pity nor platitudes, but a pragmatic suggestion: consider professional wrestling. The recommendation initially seemed absurd, a step backward into a world he had consciously avoided despite his lineage. Yet, as options dwindled, the logic became increasingly compelling. Wrestling offered immediate income potential, utilized his physical attributes, and provided a platform where his family name held recognition. More fundamentally, it represented a connection to his roots during a period when he felt utterly disconnected from himself. Johnson's decision to pursue wrestling emerged not from inspiration, but what author Andrew Solomon terms depression's cognitive narrowing, when options reduce to survival choices. He began training with his father, discovering that wrestling's physical demands differed significantly from football's. Where football valued explosive, reactive power, wrestling required choreographed precision and theatrical performance. Initially, he struggled with the artifice, his athletic background making him resistant to the scripted nature of the performances. Yet within this unfamiliar discipline, he discovered something unexpected: the creative potential of character development, the psychological interplay with audiences, and the narrative possibilities within predetermined outcomes. This period of depression, while agonizing, served crucial developmental functions. It stripped away the athletic identity that had become constricting, forcing a fundamental reevaluation of his capabilities and values. The humility born from failure would later distinguish him from contemporaries who experienced uninterrupted success. His openness about this struggle, uncommon among public figures of his generation, would eventually transform his personal vulnerability into public strength, creating connection with millions who recognized their own struggles in his narrative. The wilderness, while bleak, was preparing him for a transformation he could not yet envision.
Johnson's entry into professional wrestling in 1996 coincided with the industry's Attitude Era, a period of heightened theatricality, adult content, and intense competition for audience attention. His debut as Rocky Maivia, a combination of his father and grandfather's names, represented WWE's attempt to capitalize on his lineage while presenting a clean-cut, smiling babyface character. The reaction from audiences was immediate and brutal. They rejected the character as artificial, chanting, "Die, Rocky, die," and "Rocky sucks" during his matches. This rejection was particularly devastating because it targeted not just his performance, but his authentic identity, the very heritage he had been reluctant to embrace.
Behind the scenes, veteran wrestlers offered conflicting advice. Some advocated patience, arguing that audience rejection was part of the industry's initiation. Others suggested more aggressive character development. Johnson, drawing on his athletic background, approached wrestling with methodological rigor, studying tape of successful performers, analyzing audience reactions, and seeking mentorship from established stars like Bret Hart and The Undertaker. He recognized that his initial failure stemmed from a fundamental disconnect. He was performing a character rather than expressing an amplified version of himself. The smiling, unquestionably heroic Rocky Maivia didn't reflect the complexity of his actual experiences, the anger, the resilience, the ambition. The turning point arrived during a 1997 match in Madison Square Garden. Facing relentless booing, Johnson experienced what performers call breaking the fourth wall. He momentarily stepped out of character, locked eyes with a particularly vocal critic in the front row, and allowed his genuine frustration to show. This unscripted moment of authenticity created immediate, palpable connection. He realized that audiences weren't rejecting him personally, but the artificial construct he represented. This insight catalyzed a fundamental reinvention. He transitioned from babyface to heel, villain, embracing arrogance, manipulating crowd reactions, and developing the charismatic swagger that would become his trademark. His evolution into The Rock represented more than a name change. It was the synthesis of multiple influences: his grandfather's imposing physicality, his father's athletic precision, the verbal dexterity of wrestling's great talkers, and his own hard-won resilience. He developed what would become known as Rockyisms, colorful insults and catchphrases delivered with rhythmic intensity. Each performance became a laboratory for character development, with Johnson meticulously noting which phrases elicited strongest reactions, which gestures maximized crowd engagement, which narratives created emotional investment. This apprenticeship through rejection proved invaluable. The early failures inoculated him against later criticism, teaching him to interpret negative feedback as data rather than indictment. The wrestling arena became his graduate school in mass communication, where he learned to read diverse audiences, adapt in real time, and translate authenticity into entertainment. By 1998, the same crowds that had chanted for his demise were echoing his catchphrases and buying his merchandise. He had transformed rejection into connection, failure into foundation, a pattern that would repeat throughout his career. The transformation of Dwayne Johnson into The Rock represents one of professional wrestling's most remarkable reinventions, blending athletic excellence, psychological acuity, and cultural timing. As The Rock, Johnson synthesized multiple personas: the arrogant villain who reveled in audience disdain, the charismatic anti-hero whose confidence bordered on parody, and eventually the beloved champion whose catchphrases entered popular lexicon. His famous eyebrow raise, a gesture of mocking superiority, became instantly recognizable, while phrases like "know your role" and "just bring it" transcended wrestling to become cultural touchstones. His ascent within WWE coincided with the company's global expansion, positioning him as a central figure in wrestling's mainstream breakthrough. Matches against Stone Cold Steve Austin drew unprecedented pay-per-view numbers, while his verbal battles with Mick Foley, Mankind, demonstrated his ability to balance physical brutality with comedic timing.
Johnson understood wrestling's essential duality. It was both athletic competition and serialized drama, requiring performers to maintain character consistency across multiple platforms. He extended his persona through interviews, television appearances, and eventually film cameos, creating a multimedia presence that expanded wrestling's traditional boundaries.
The story doesn't end here. Part 2 reveals what comes next. Turn on notifications. You don't want to miss it.